A poor girl returned, a stranger's wallet without taking a dime, and unknowingly changed her life. Before we begin the story, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The rain had a way of making the city feel lonelier than usual. On the cracked sidewalks of downtown Seattle, as commuters rushed past with heads down and umbrellas up, Maya Sullivan walked with her hood pulled tight and her thoughts far from the wet street beneath her feet. She was tired. Not just from her 10-hour shift at the public library, but from the kind of exhaustion that came from constantly giving more than life seemed to return. Her boots soaked through, her tote bag heavy with returns and groceries, and her only reward waiting at home was a dimly lit apartment and leftovers that barely qualified as dinner. She paused at a bench near an old coffee stand that had long since closed for the night, shifting her bag to rest her aching shoulder. That's when she saw it, a wallet, lying just at the edge of the bench, rain dripping from its corner. Black leather, thick, out of place in this part of the city. She glanced around. No one, just wet pavement and the faint sound of a saxophone playing from a distant street performer beneath an overhang. Maya reached for the wallet slowly, as if it might be a trap. The leather was high-end, unmistakably so. When she opened it, her breath caught. Bills. Dozens of them. 50s. Hundreds. Folded crisply. A credit card gleamed beneath the cash. Black. Heavy. The kind reserved for the ultra-wealthy. Tucked behind an ID card with a striking headshot was a business card. Ryan Caldwell. Founder and CEO. No number. Just an email and an address. She blinked at the name. It rang a bell, though she couldn't place it. The photo was of a man in his early 30s, sharp-jawed and serious, the kind of face you might see in Forbes or on the cover of Wired. Her heart began to pound, not from excitement, but from the weight of the moment. The street was still deserted. No one would know. She could take just a little, not all of it, just enough to make next month's rent less painful. Enough to finally buy her brother a new pair of shoes, or her grandmother the better meds Medicare wouldn't cover. But she didn't move. She sat down on the wet bench, staring at the wallet in her hands like it might catch fire. Her fingers trembled, not with greed, but with something worse. Temptation paired with disappointment. She had always been the one who did the right thing. And what had it gotten her? A cheating ex who emptied her savings. An exhausted body from overwork. A world that barely noticed when she showed up. A voice inside whispered, "Take it." She shut the wallet firmly, almost angrily, and slipped it into her bag. "No," she said aloud to no one. "That's not who I am." And that was the truth, even if being that kind of person often hurt. Even if it meant staying invisible in a city that only seemed to reward the loud, the greedy, the fast. Back home in her third-floor walk-up, Maya placed the wallet on her kitchen table as though it were a bomb. She wiped her wet hair from her face and turned on her old laptop. She typed the name Ryan Caldwell into a search bar, more curious than anything now. The results loaded instantly. Ryan Caldwell, tech wunderkind, founder of a fast-scaling AI health tech company valued at over $900 million, reclusive, private, known for keeping his distance from media and for being notoriously skeptical of good deeds. Maya exhaled, stunned. "Of course," she whispered. She found the company website, a minimalist design. Cold, distant, no hotline, no assistant names, just a sterile contact form. She typed, "Subject, found wallet." Message. I found a wallet today on Pine Street. ID says Ryan Caldwell. I didn't take anything, just hoping it gets back to the right hands. She stared at the message before clicking send. She didn't expect a reply. She certainly didn't expect gratitude, but what she could never have known in that quiet, rain-slicked moment was that this single, unseen act of honesty, an act she would soon forget, was the spark that would set an entire story into motion. A story that would test her beliefs, her heart, and eventually lead her to a kind of love she never thought was meant for someone like her. But for now, it was just a wallet and one quiet decision to be good when no one was watching. The email reply arrived the next morning, crisp and emotionless. Subject, Re. Found wallet from AdminCaldwellInnovations.com. Dear Ms. Sullivan, thank you for contacting us regarding Mr. Caldwell's wallet. Please bring it to our corporate office at 730 Fifth Avenue, Suite 2300, anytime between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. Ask for Darcy at reception. That was it. No. Thank you for your honesty. No. Mr. Caldwell appreciates your effort. Just a cold typed acknowledgement and an address in the heart of Seattle's business district. Maya stared at the screen, lips pressed together. What had she expected? Some kind of heartfelt gratitude? A conversation? She should have known better. Still, by 10 a.m., she was standing at the base of a towering glass building, clutching the wallet inside her tote bag. She had changed into her best pair of jeans and a clean blouse, still modest, but enough to feel a little less invisible. The elevator was quiet and fast, and when it opened on the 23rd floor, the air changed. Sleek marble floors, walls of polished walnut, modern art, a receptionist with perfectly styled hair, and a headset that looked more expensive than Maya's monthly grocery bill greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. You must be Ms. Sullivan, she said. Darcy will be out shortly. Maya nodded, suddenly feeling out of place among the tailored suits and glass walls. A moment later, a woman in a fitted gray suit approached briskly. Thank you for coming, she said with practiced efficiency. Mr. Caldwell is in meetings all day, but he asked me to personally thank you for returning his property. He also wanted you to have this. Darcy handed her a sealed envelope. Maya blinked. Oh, I didn't return it for a reward. It's standard, Darcy replied, already motioning toward the elevator. We appreciate your time. Maya took the envelope reluctantly. The entire exchange had lasted under 2 minutes. No eye contact, no interest, just a transaction. On her way down, she stared at her reflection in the mirrored walls of the elevator, wondering if anyone in that building had ever done something out of pure kindness. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, she opened the envelope. Cash. At least $500, all in crisp $100 bills. She froze, unsure of how to feel. Was this a generous gesture or hush money? A thank you or a dismissal? She held the envelope for a long moment, then walked down the block and dropped it in a nearby donation box for a local youth shelter. It didn't feel right to keep it. Not when the message had been so clear. Take this and leave. What Maya couldn't see was that 40 stories above, behind a pane of soundproof glass, Ryan Caldwell was watching the entire interaction unfold in real time. He had instructed Darcy to handle it like usual, assuming the person who found the wallet would be grateful, maybe opportunistic. That's how most people responded. But something about the girl's body language made him pause. The way she hesitated before taking the envelope. The expression on her face as she read the money inside. Then he watched, stunned, as she walked away and gave it all up. No show, no demand, just gone. He leaned back in his chair slowly. "Who does that?" he muttered aloud. Ryan had built a company on algorithms and predictability, yet here was someone who had broken the pattern. Someone who had chosen integrity not for applause, but out of something rarer. He rewound the footage and watched again, eyes narrowing, not in suspicion, but in intrigue. He didn't know her story. He didn't even know her first name until he pulled up the email. But he knew one thing. This wasn't a woman looking for attention. And that made her unforgettable. What began as a forgotten wallet on a rainy sidewalk had now sparked the attention of a man who rarely gave anyone a second thought. Ryan Caldwell, once certain he had people figured out, now found himself asking a question he hadn't in years. Who is she really? And why couldn't he stop thinking about her? Ryan Caldwell wasn't used to being curious about strangers. In his world of high-stakes investments, billion-dollar mergers, and media facades, people either had value or they didn't. He was rarely surprised, and when he was, it usually came with a price tag. But the woman who returned his wallet, a woman who walked into his office without expectation, who refused the money and walked out without glancing back, had done something to him he couldn't quite explain. She interrupted his algorithm, and now, for the first time in years, he felt compelled to know more. He called his assistant back in. "Darcy, the woman who returned the wallet, her name was Maya Sullivan, right?" Darcy nodded. "Yes. Her email was in the system. She didn't leave a phone number. Find out where she works." Darcy hesitated. "Do you want me to contact her?" "No," Ryan said quickly. Too quickly. He adjusted his tone. "Not yet. Just, I want to know more." 2 hours later, he had his answer. Maya Sullivan, 29. She worked at a small local bookstore in Capitol Hill, owned by a retired professor. No social media presence beyond a quiet Instagram page filled with photos of used books, cozy coffee cups, and vintage poetry. No scandal, no self-promotion, nothing artificial. She lived in a modest walk-up on 12th Avenue. Single, clean record, quiet life. And yet, she had left an impression deeper than anyone in his gilded circle ever had. That Saturday, Ryan did something unthinkable. He left his driver behind, traded his tailored suit for a navy sweater and jeans, and walked 3 blocks from his condo to the bookstore. The bell above the door jingled softly as he stepped in. The shop was warm, inviting, with high wooden shelves and the faint scent of old pages. A small jazz melody played from a dusty record player. It was quiet, timeless. Then he saw her. Maya. She was kneeling near a lower shelf, rearranging a row of paperbacks, completely unaware that the man whose wallet she had returned was standing behind her. He watched her for a second longer than he should have, and when she turned, brushing a strand of hair from her face, he offered a practiced smile. "Hi, I'm looking for a book." She returned the smile politely, not recognizing him. "Any particular kind?" "Something unexpected," he said, unsure of why he chose those words. Maya tilted her head, considering. That's vague. But let's try this." She reached for a hardcover and handed it to him. Olive Kitteridge. It's honest, not flashy, but it stays with you. He looked at the cover, then at her. "Is that your pitch?" She smirked. It's the truth. I'm not a salesman. I just know what moves people. He nodded, flipping through the pages, even though he wasn't reading. So, do you think good people still exist? She blinked at the question. That's a strange thing to ask about a book. Humor me, he said. She looked thoughtful. I think good people don't always get noticed. They move quietly. They don't ask for applause. Ryan's throat tightened. And is it worth it? Doing good, even if no one sees? Maya gave a small laugh, almost sad. That's the only time it really matters, when no one's watching. There it was, that same clarity, that same quiet integrity that had pulled at him through the camera screen. She was real, and for the first time, he felt like someone was speaking to him. Not the man with money, not the public figure, but just him. As she rang up the book, he said, "You know, I don't usually come to places like this." She looked amused. "That's obvious. You've been holding that book upside down for 5 minutes." He laughed, and it wasn't forced. As he left, she called out, "Hope the book surprises you." He turned, nodding. It already has. He stepped out into the cold air, gripping the novel like it meant something. He didn't know what this was, an infatuation, a fascination, or something deeper. But he knew he was going back. He wasn't ready to tell her who he was. Not yet. For once, he wanted someone to meet him without the shield of his name. And Maya Sullivan had already seen more of him than anyone else ever had. She just didn't know it yet. Ryan didn't plan to return the very next day, but when Sunday morning arrived with its quiet chill and filtered sunlight through his penthouse windows, he found himself reaching for the same sweater he'd worn the day before. It was ridiculous, he told himself. Absurd, even. But there was a pull he couldn't quite explain. A softness in her voice, a resilience in her honesty, a weightless curiosity in her presence. The kind that lingered even when she was gone. He walked the 12 blocks this time, bypassing the tinted glass of his parked luxury car. Something about the motion made it easier to think. Or maybe it helped him forget how easy it would be to ruin whatever this was if he moved too fast, spoke too freely. He didn't want to lose her gaze, the way she looked at him without expectation, without knowing what his name could buy. When he entered the bookstore again, the bell announced his arrival like it had the day before. Maya was behind the counter, reading with one hand tucked under her chin, her eyes flicking up the moment she heard the sound. She smiled, recognizing him, though still unaware of who he really was. "You're back," she said, setting her book aside. He nodded, walking toward her slowly. "I finished Olive Kitteridge. You were right. It lingers." She grinned, her eyes lighting up. "You actually read it?" "Every word." Most people come in asking for something deep and meaningful, and then drop it halfway through. I guess I'm not most people. "No," she said thoughtfully. "You're definitely not." Ryan felt that line settle inside him in a way that surprised him. They talked for a few minutes about the story, its quiet heartbreaks and subtle truths. Maya spoke like someone who had lived inside those pages, someone who found company in words when the world grew too loud. And then something unexpected happened. A small boy, no older than 8, wandered into the shop, holding a tattered dollar bill in his hand. He looked around nervously until Maya leaned over the counter and asked gently, "Looking for something, bud?" "My mom said I could buy a book," he said shyly. eyes scanning the shelves. But it has to be a cheap one. Maya stepped around the counter without hesitation. Then I've got just the section for you. Ryan watched as she knelt beside the boy near a shelf of used paperbacks. She asked what he liked to read. Let him describe a story about a dragon and a girl who wasn't afraid of fire. Within minutes, she'd pulled a worn fantasy novel off the shelf, flipping through the pages with him. The boy lit up as she handed it to him. That one's on special today, she whispered with a wink. Only costs exactly $1. The boy beamed, handed over his crumpled bill, and ran out moments later, clutching his treasure like gold. Maya walked back to the counter, eyes meeting Ryan's. That book wasn't on special. I figured it should have been. He needed it. Ryan smiled quietly. He felt something unfamiliar rising inside him, something like admiration, but purer. It was easy to admire brilliance in business, quick thinking, market timing. But this was different. This was admiration for kindness, for humility, for seeing people others overlooked. It unnerved him how much it mattered to him. You do this often, he asked. What? Lie about book prices? She smirked. No, he said. Make strangers feel like they matter. Maya leaned back slightly, surprised by the question. I don't think about it that way. I guess I just try to be the kind of person I needed when I was younger. He didn't ask what she meant, though her words echoed louder than the music in the shop. There was a story behind them, a weight she carried quietly. Later, as he left the bookstore, she called after him again. Tomorrow, we're doing a book club night, if you're not busy. He turned slowly, the invitation hanging in the air like a thread between them. Wouldn't miss it. That night, Ryan sat on his couch staring at the city skyline, his phone buzzing with missed calls from board members, an invitation to speak at a finance summit in Singapore, and a PR rep asking about his next philanthropic campaign. But all he could think about was the woman who sold a child a story for $1 and didn't need the world to applaud her for it. He wasn't sure what he was walking into, only that whatever Maya Sullivan was teaching him, he hadn't even scratched the surface. The following evening, the bookstore had a different energy. The soft glow from the overhead lights felt warmer, and the normally quiet hum of pages turning had been replaced with low conversations, occasional laughter, and the clinking of mismatched mugs filled with tea. A handwritten sign taped to the door read, Book Club Night, All Souls Welcome. Ryan arrived just before 7, unsure of what to expect. He had attended 100 corporate networking events, sat through formal galas with champagne towers and highbrow toasts, but nothing about this felt performative. It felt real, unpolished and human in the best way. He wore a simple navy sweater and jeans, blending in for once, grateful not to be recognized. Maya was setting up chairs in a loose circle near the back of the store. She glanced up and smiled when she saw him. You came. You invited me, he said, grabbing 2 folding chairs and helping her finish the circle. He noticed the way she moved, efficient but unhurried, like someone who had learned to make peace with time. Around them, a small group of regulars were settling in. An older couple who owned the flower shop down the street. A young artist with paint stains on her fingers. A man with a service dog who read slowly but spoke with careful passion. Everyone here had their own corners of life, and yet they had all gathered for one reason: to share something they loved. Tonight's book was A Man Called Ove. Ryan hadn't read it, but he'd skimmed enough to fake familiarity. Still, once the discussion began, he found himself forgetting the need to perform. The conversation was full of honesty, people relating their lives to the story without ego or pretense. Maya didn't lead the group with authority. She simply nudged it, asked the kind of questions that didn't just unpack the book, but opened hearts. When it was his turn to speak, Ryan paused, holding the worn copy in his hand. "I think the thing that struck me most," he said slowly, "was how Ovi kept showing up for people, even when he didn't want to, even when he didn't understand why. It made me realize sometimes love looks like staying, not because it's easy, but because it matters." There was a stillness in the group after he spoke. Not dramatic, just quiet respect. Maya gave him a small nod, not as if to say, "Good job," but as if to say, "I see you." After the session ended, people lingered, chatting and helping to tidy the space. Ryan stayed behind, waiting as Maya wiped down the counter and stacked the remaining chairs. "I didn't know you were such a poet," she said teasingly, drying her hands on a cloth. He smiled. "I'm not. That was more personal than I intended to be." Sometimes the right words just slip out when you stop trying too hard. They stood in companionable silence for a few moments, the shop now empty, the rain tapping gently on the windows again. "Can I walk you home?" he asked, the question feeling absurdly old-fashioned. Maya hesitated for half a second, then nodded. "Sure." The walk was quiet at first. The streets were slick from the drizzle, glowing under streetlights. Maya lived in a modest brownstone 3 blocks from the store. Along the way, they passed a park where someone had left birdseed in mason jars and a mural half-painted with the words, "Love lives here." "So," she said at last, "you never told me what you actually do." Ryan's breath caught, just a little. He had rehearsed this moment in his head and still didn't feel ready. "I work in tech," he said simply. She arched an eyebrow. "That's vague." "I've started a few companies, mostly in software. These days, I invest in things. Try to stay out of the spotlight." "Ah," she said with a knowing smile. "So you're one of those mysterious, too cool for LinkedIn types." "Guilty," he chuckled. "Honestly, I didn't want to lead with it. People treat you differently." "Probably because it's not about what you do," she said. "It's about how you make people feel." They reached her building, and she turned toward him on the stoop. "I had a good time tonight. You should come again." "I will," he said, surprised by how much he meant it. She smiled, hand resting lightly on the railing. "Good night, Ryan." "Good night, Maya." He didn't move until she disappeared inside, and even then, he stood there a moment longer, listening to the city, wondering how someone who returned a lost wallet had somehow made him feel like the one who'd been found. In the days that followed, something began to shift between Maya and Ryan, quietly, like the slow turn of a page. There was no grand declaration, no official moment that marked a new beginning, and yet, everything between them started to feel different. Ryan found himself rerouting his afternoons just to pass by the bookstore, claiming to be in the neighborhood, even though it was never quite on the way. Sometimes he brought pastries from the bakery 2 blocks over. Other times, he simply stepped in to ask for a book recommendation, but it was never about the books. It was about her. Maya noticed, of course. She wasn't oblivious. She had learned to read people the way she read stories, not just for what they said, but for what they left unsaid. Ryan's presence was always accompanied by a sense of restraint, like he was trying hard not to overstep, not to intrude, not to let her see too much too soon. And yet, he was constant, consistent, present in a way that made her feel, for the first time in a long time, safe. One Saturday morning, the city was blanketed in a light fog, the kind that softened everything. The edges of buildings, the noise of traffic, even time itself. Maya was unlocking the store when she turned to see Ryan waiting on the corner, holding 2 cups of coffee and a sheepish smile. She raised an eyebrow. "I figured you hadn't had breakfast yet," he said, handing her one. "Also, I read that book you recommended, The Remains of the Day. It wrecked me." She laughed softly, taking the cup. "It's a quiet kind of wreckage, the kind that sneaks up on you." They stood outside the shop, leaning against the frame of the doorway, sipping in silence as the fog curled around them. Ryan looked at her, really looked, and for the first time, he felt the urge to say more, to tell her who he was, really. But something held him back. Not fear of rejection, not quite. It was something deeper, something like reverence. He didn't want to break whatever fragile honesty they had built by turning himself into a headline. That afternoon, Maya invited him to help with a community event. A local children's charity was hosting a story day at the park, and the bookstore was donating books and volunteers. Ryan agreed instantly, though part of him felt a ripple of nervousness. He was used to boardrooms, not reading circles on picnic blankets. By noon, they were in Riverside Park, surrounded by giggles and grass-stained sneakers. Maya moved through the event like she belonged there, handing out bookmarks to shy kids, crouching beside toddlers to recommend their next favorite story. Ryan watched her from a distance at first, trying to figure out where he fit into the picture. A little girl with pigtails tugged at his sleeve, holding up a book with wide, hopeful eyes. Without thinking, he dropped to the grass and began reading. The sun climbed higher, the pages turned, and something softened in him. He wasn't Ryan Cole, tech investor, in that moment. He was just a guy in a hoodie, reading about dragons and moonlight to children who didn't care what he did for a living. And Maya, catching a glimpse of him laughing with the kids, felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear, something warmer, something terrifyingly hopeful. Later, as they packed up the last of the blankets and half-eaten snacks, Maya handed Ryan a folded poster with crayon drawings and thank you messages from the children. "For you," she said. He looked at it, then at her. "Why me?" "Because they liked you, and because I think you need reminding sometimes that you're more than what you do." Ryan didn't respond. He just nodded, swallowing a lump in his throat that had caught him by surprise. That night, sitting on the floor of his penthouse, surrounded by silence and the distant glow of the city, Ryan unrolled the poster again. He traced one small hand-drawn heart with his fingers and thought of Maya's laugh, the way she knelt beside the kids, the way she didn't expect anyone to impress her, just to be real. He had spent so long building a life based on visibility, on validation, on being the man everyone watched. But with her, he was learning how to be unseen and still matter. And that realization, that startling, beautiful truth, was the beginning of something he didn't yet know how to name. But he was ready to follow it, wherever it led. The crispness of fall had settled in Central Park as golden leaves swirled around Maya's boots. She had just finished her morning run, earbuds tucked away, when her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Ryan. "There's something I want to show you. Can I pick you up later?" She hesitated for only a moment before replying with a simple, "Okay." That single word was heavy with curiosity, laced with a warmth that had been quietly building between them for weeks. That evening, Ryan pulled up in a modest black SUV. Not his usual chauffeur-driven town car, but something more grounded, more intentional. Maya climbed in, clutching her scarf tightly against the autumn wind. He smiled as she buckled in. "I figured we'd escape the noise tonight," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. She glanced sideways at him, sensing a nervous energy beneath his calm exterior. "Where are we going?" she asked. "You'll see." They drove for nearly an hour, the skyline fading behind them, replaced by winding roads and tree-lined paths. Finally, they arrived at a quiet stretch of land on the Hudson River, just past Tarrytown. A small house stood alone at the edge of the woods, modern yet warm, its large windows glowing softly with interior light. "It's beautiful," Maya whispered. "Whose is it?" Ryan exhaled slowly before answering. "Mine. But no one knows I come here. This is where I go when I want to breathe." Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and something sweeter, perhaps vanilla from an old candle still clinging to the air. He led her to a sunken living room with walls of glass and shelves filled not with awards or artifacts of wealth, but with books, vintage cameras, and framed Polaroids of quiet moments. A bird on a branch, the ocean at dusk, a child's crayon drawing labeled Uncle R. "I didn't expect this," Maya said, eyes sweeping the room. Ryan sat on the edge of the couch, watching her take it all in. "That's the point. No one ever does." Maya wandered over to a record player and ran her fingers along the collection stacked beside it. She pulled one out, Simon and Garfunkel, and placed the needle with care. Music crackled softly through the room, threading around the stillness like memory. "You brought me here for a reason," she said after a moment, turning to face him. He stood slowly, then walked over to a small wooden box near the fireplace. Opening it, he pulled out a leather object, old, worn. It was a wallet. Her heart paused. "You kept it?" she asked, eyes wide. "Of course I did," Ryan said. "You gave it back to me when no one was looking." That moment, when you made a choice that cost you nothing but could have meant everything, it changed something in me. He crossed the space between them, placing the wallet in her hands. "This was never about money, Maya. Not really. It was about what it meant. You reminded me of who I wanted to be before I got lost and who I thought I had to become." She stared at the wallet, then at him. "I didn't expect anything in return," she said softly. "I know. That's what made it matter." There was a silence between them then. Not awkward, not tense, just full. As if the air was waiting to see what they would do next. Maya looked around the room once more, seeing not a millionaire's hideaway, but a sanctuary of someone who had been yearning to be seen. "You hide here," she said gently. "You come here to be yourself. But what if you didn't have to hide anymore?" Ryan looked at her, the mask of charm he wore in the outside world falling completely away. "I've never told anyone about this place, not even my team. But you," he faltered. "You feel like the only real thing in a life that's been carefully curated." Maya stepped closer. "Then stop curating. Start living." Her words weren't a command. They were an invitation, one he'd been waiting to hear for years. He reached for her hand. It was a simple gesture. No dramatics, no fireworks. Just the quiet honesty of two people standing in the middle of a truth that had been unfolding between them all along. They sat by the fire until midnight, wrapped in quiet conversation, hands brushing occasionally as the flames danced low. And in the sanctuary Ryan had built to be alone, he found himself, for the first time in a long while, wanting to be completely known. Not for his name or his fortune, but for the man who had been buried beneath all that for far too long. And Maya, guarded and careful, began to believe that maybe love didn't always arrive loudly. Maybe it came like this, softly, with a returned wallet and a door left open in the woods. The first signs of winter crept into the city as Maya walked the narrow aisles of the bookstore where she worked. Snow hadn't arrived yet, but the air was brisk, biting just enough to turn breaths into clouds. She adjusted a display of holiday-themed novels and tried not to think too hard about the last few weeks. Since the night at Ryan's river house, something between them had shifted, gently, irrevocably. He hadn't said the word love, and neither had she, but it hung in the air between them like a whispered promise waiting to be spoken aloud. He had started showing up at the bookstore more often, not as Ryan Harper, the elusive tech mogul, but as the man who liked secondhand poetry books and herbal tea and listening to her hum softly while shelving. They shared quiet lunches in the back room, swapped thoughts on favorite authors, and on slow evenings, he helped her restock without ever announcing himself to the customers. Mo still had no idea who he really was, and Maya didn't offer it up. She liked him this way, unpolished, unguarded, real. But even as they grew closer, Maya could feel an invisible boundary neither of them dared to cross. A part of her still hesitated, clinging to the remnants of self-protection, afraid that everything would vanish the moment she believed in it too much. And Ryan, he had begun smiling more, laughing in ways that sounded unlearned, but he hadn't brought her fully into his world. Not yet. She didn't know if it was caution or fear or something else entirely. Then, one Thursday afternoon, she received an envelope. It was waiting for her at the front desk, addressed in Ryan's handwriting. No postage, no fanfare, just her name. Inside, a note. I want to show you something important. Friday night. Dress warm. Trust me. The next evening, she found him waiting outside the shop, his car idling gently under the street lamp. He didn't say much on the drive, just glanced over every so often with that quiet intensity she had come to recognize as something deeper than words. They left the city behind again, but this time took a different route, winding through the Catskills until they arrived at an open field beneath a blanket of stars. In the center was a large tent lit from within, glowing softly against the dark landscape. "What is this?" she asked as he took her hand and led her toward it. "You'll see," he said, smiling as he pulled back the flap. Inside, it looked nothing like she'd expected. It wasn't fancy. No catered dinner, no high-end decor, just rows of chairs filled with people, some in hoodies, some in coats worn at the elbows. A small stage stood at the front, and on it, a banner that read, "The Honesty Fund, a night for the invisible heroes." Maya's breath caught as Ryan turned to face her. "You once said no one sees the people who do the right thing when no one's watching. I've spent years surrounded by people who take and fake and spin, but you reminded me that truth still lives in small, quiet acts. I wanted to do something about that. He guided her to the front row, where a woman in her 60s was just beginning to speak. She told a story about finding a lost child on a subway and staying with him for 6 hours until the mother could be found. No one had ever thanked her. She didn't expect anyone to. But tonight, she received a grant that would help her fix the broken heater in her apartment and pay her overdue medical bills. Person after person stood on that stage: grocery clerks, janitors, waitresses, bus drivers, all of them people who had done something good and never been seen for it. Until now. Ryan sat beside Maya, silent, eyes fixed on the speakers. She reached for his hand without thinking. He laced his fingers through hers, gently, but without hesitation. After the last person spoke, Ryan stood and stepped onto the stage. No notes, no screen behind him. Just him, under a single spotlight. "This isn't a charity," he said, voice calm but firm. "It's a celebration of people who choose honesty when no one rewards it, who show up with goodness when the world gives them nothing in return." Maya inspired this. She didn't know she was doing it, but that's what makes all of you extraordinary. Maya felt her throat tighten. She wasn't used to being the center of anything, let alone a story like this. When Ryan stepped down, he knelt by her seat and whispered, "You said you didn't need to be thanked, but I needed the world to know what it looks like to live with integrity. And I needed you to know that you started something I'll never stop building." Later that night, they stood together outside the tent, breath misting in the cold air, the stars glowing more clearly than either of them remembered. "You scared me," Maya said, leaning into him. He smiled down at her. "Why?" "Because no one's ever seen me the way you do. And because I don't know how to stop feeling like the other shoe will drop." He brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "Maybe it won't. Maybe it's just finally your time to be chosen without conditions." The night was quiet again. But this time, the silence didn't feel uncertain. It felt like space. Open. Limitless. Waiting for what they would choose to build together next. The weeks that followed the night, under the stars, felt like a quiet turning point, not just for Maya and Ryan, but for something deeper neither of them had quite named. Their days found new rhythm, a blend of stillness and motion, work and wonder. Maya continued her shifts at the bookstore, more out of love than necessity now, while Ryan, for the first time in years, began to slow down. He wasn't abandoning his empire, but rather rebuilding how he approached it, letting something softer guide him instead of strategy alone. One Sunday morning, Maya was curled up on the couch of Ryan's loft apartment in Tribeca, sunlight spilling over her as she read through grant applications for the Honesty Fund. Her glasses were sliding down her nose, hair loose from sleep, a mug of lukewarm coffee beside her. Ryan walked in, barefoot, a sleepy smile on his face. He watched her for a moment before speaking. "Do you know what you look like right now?" She looked up, arching an eyebrow. "Please don't say tired." "No," he chuckled, walking closer. "You look like peace. Like everything I never realized I needed." She blushed, trying to hide it behind the papers in her lap. "You're getting too good at this romantic dialogue. I've had the best teacher." Shaim, their laughter echoed quietly through the apartment. But it wasn't just lightness they were learning to share. There were harder days, too. Moments when Maya recoiled at the public attention now quietly stirring around them, when headlines whispered of a mystery woman in the tech mogul's life. Ryan did everything to shield her from the noise, even pulling back on interviews, declining appearances. But Maya wasn't asking him to retreat. She was only asking for honesty, for space to grow into this life on her own terms. One afternoon, she asked him if she could visit the place where it all started, the field outside the city where he had set up the tent for the Honesty Fund launch. Ryan agreed instantly, and they drove there in silence, letting the hum of the road fill the quiet. The field looked different in winter. The wildflowers had withered into brittle stalks, the grass a pale gold, but beneath the dormancy, there was still a hum of promise. Maya stepped out first, wrapping her scarf tighter, boots crunching softly on the frozen earth. "This place feels sacred," she said, more to herself than to Ryan. "It is, to me," he replied, joining her. "It's where I stopped thinking of everything as a transaction." They stood together for a while, not saying much, simply letting the quiet do its work. Then, after a long pause, Maya turned toward him. "Ryan," she said slowly, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I haven't said, because maybe I wasn't sure it would ever feel safe to say it." His eyes searched hers, open, patient. "I've spent most of my life trying not to need anyone, trying to be okay on my own. And then you came along, with this life I didn't ask for, and this heart I wasn't expecting. And you didn't just see me. You gave me back the part of myself I thought I'd lost." He reached for her hand, fingers intertwining gently. "I love you," she said, voice steady but soft, like it had taken all her courage and none at all. Ryan exhaled like he had been holding his breath for months. He stepped closer, cupped her face in his hands, and said, "Maya, I've loved you since the moment you returned that wallet and asked for nothing in return. I just didn't know how to deserve it." Tears welled up in her eyes, and this time she didn't hide them. "You never had to earn love. Just show up with it. And you do, Ryan. Every day." He kissed her then. Not a rushed, movie scene kiss, but one full of memory and hope, and the quiet certainty that this was no longer a story of two strangers crossing paths, but of two people choosing to walk forward together. As the sky turned lavender above the quiet field, and the wind curled around them like a question already answered, Maya and Ryan knew that the story they had begun in silence was ready for its next chapter. One written not in fear or chance, but in truth. A year had passed since the day Maya handed over a lost wallet on a quiet sidewalk, never imagining that moment would open the door to a life she hadn't dared to dream of. Now, as spring returned to New York, soft and slow like a forgotten melody, the city buzzed with new beginnings, and none more quietly profound than the one being written between her and Ryan. Their days were fuller now, but not in the way that meant chaos or noise. Fuller in the sense of meaning, of depth. The Honesty Fund had grown from a passion project into a recognized platform, lifting people who had acted selflessly into opportunities they never thought they'd see. Ryan had shifted his empire from a fortress of ambition to a vessel for purpose. And Maya, still working part-time at the bookstore she loved, had become a quiet voice of wisdom behind the scenes, the kind that people leaned toward when the world felt too loud. It was a Saturday when Ryan suggested they take a walk through Central Park. The air was warm enough for light jackets. The first flowers had begun to bloom, and everything felt alive. Maya wore a long cardigan over her favorite sundress, hair loose in the wind, fingers laced with his as they strolled beneath the soft green canopy. There was an easiness in their silence, the kind born not from emptiness, but from comfort. They stopped near Bow Bridge, a place Maya had once told him felt like a fairy tale. He looked at her then, studying the curve of her smile, the way sunlight kissed her cheekbones. "Maya," he said, pulling her hand gently toward a nearby bench. "I know neither of us saw this coming. Not that night. Not when I watched you walk away in the rain, dropping that envelope into the trash like it meant nothing. But to me, that was the moment everything changed." She smiled softly, sensing the shift in his tone, her heart quickening with a mix of knowing and wonder. "I've built so much with logic, with control," he continued, "but you've shown me something greater than structure. You've shown me what it means to be human, to be real, to be vulnerable and still strong. And I want every day forward to be shaped by that truth." Then, from his coat pocket, he pulled out a small velvet box. Maya froze. Her breath caught. "I don't want the rest of my life to be built around numbers or headlines or deals," Ryan said, his voice steady and full. "I want it to be built around books and laughter, around morning coffees and late night talks, around us. Will you marry me, Maya?" The world seemed to fall silent around them. All she could hear was the soft rustle of trees and the thudding of her heart. And in Ryan's eyes, she didn't see the billionaire, the empire, the man behind the press. She saw the boy who learned to care, the man who chose kindness over pride, the person who had loved her, not for how she looked or what she had, but for who she was when no one else was watching. She reached out, touched his face gently, and whispered, "Yes." He didn't jump up or cheer. He just leaned forward and kissed her, the kind of kiss that speaks not of beginnings, but of everything they had already overcome to get here. A few months later, they married not in a cathedral or on the cover of a glossy magazine, but in the little community garden near the bookstore, where volunteers brought folding chairs and the florist down the street donated wildflowers. The vows were quiet, spoken only for each other. No crowd, just close friends, family, and a handful of people who had been lifted by the Honesty Fund. Maya wore a simple ivory dress, barefoot on the grass, and Ryan wore no tie, just a linen shirt and a look of absolute peace. In her vows, Maya said, "You were the unexpected chapter in my story. But now, I can't imagine the story without you. You've taught me that love isn't about rescuing or being rescued. It's about choosing each other every day." And he said, "You returned a lost wallet, Maya. But what you really returned was my sense of wonder. You reminded me what it means to be decent, to be whole, to be seen, and I vow, every day, to see you." After the ceremony, they danced beneath strings of soft lights, barefoot on the earth, surrounded by laughter and joy that didn't need grandeur to be felt. A little girl handed Maya a daisy. An older couple, married 50 years, held hands nearby and cried softly at the sight of something so real. Later that night, back at their home, Maya curled up beside Ryan on the couch. The wedding dress was draped over a chair. The apartment was still humming with the echoes of happiness. "I keep thinking about that day," she said. "The day I found your wallet." He smiled. "Best thing I ever lost." They laughed, but then he turned to her, more serious. "Do you think, if it hadn't been me, if it had just been a stranger's wallet, you still would have returned it?" She didn't even pause. "Yes, because it was never about who might be watching. It was about who I wanted to be. He pulled her close, resting his head against hers. And in the quiet that followed, they didn't need to say anything else. Their story wasn't perfect. It wasn't grand in the way fairy tales often are. But it was real, honest. And in a world that too often mistook flash for substance, theirs was the kind of love that bloomed slowly, steadily, like a daisy pushing through concrete. And it all began with a single choice: to return something lost, and in doing so, discover something irreplaceable. Ryan and Maya's story is a gentle but powerful reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of integrity can lead to the most extraordinary transformations. It began with a lost wallet on a quiet street, and a woman who, despite all the reasons the world had given her to become jaded, still chose honesty. Maya didn't return that wallet because of who it belonged to. She didn't know. She returned it because of who she was. That single decision, rooted in principle and quiet strength, opened a path neither of them could have foreseen. For Ryan, it shattered the illusion that everyone in his world wanted something from him. He had lived surrounded by wealth, power, and flattery, yet felt more invisible than ever. It wasn't until he saw Maya walk away from a reward she never asked for that he began to see what was missing from his life: sincerity, purpose, connection. And for Maya, who had been through betrayal, loneliness, and years of quiet struggle, meeting Ryan was never about being swept off her feet. It was about being truly seen and valued without having to change who she was. Their love grew not from grand gestures, but from shared silences, thoughtful conversations, and simple truths. It was a love built on respect, resilience, and a willingness to see beyond the surface. Together, they learned that authenticity is more powerful than any mask, and that healing doesn't come from erasing the past, but from choosing something better in spite of it. Maya never needed saving, and Ryan never needed impressing. They met each other exactly where they were, and built something real from there. Their journey reminds us that real connection doesn't come from appearances or status, but from the courage to be kind, even when no one is looking, and the bravery to let someone in, even when your heart has been bruised before. The lesson from their story is simple yet profound. Doing the right thing matters, even when it's hard, even when it's unseen. In a world that often rewards shortcuts and noise, choosing honesty, humility, and compassion can feel like swimming against the current. But it's those very choices that shape who we are. And sometimes they open doors we never expected. The way we treat people when we think it won't matter says everything about who we are. And sometimes, like in Maya's case, it ends up mattering more than we could ever imagine. So if you've ever doubted whether being kind, honest, or true to yourself makes a difference, let this story be your answer. It does. It always does. And one day, when you least expect it, that decision might just change your life. If this story touched your heart, inspired you, or reminded you of the quiet power of goodness, please support our channel by subscribing. Your support gives us the motivation to keep sharing stories that matter, stories that heal, uplift, and remind us of the beauty still left in the world. See you in the next story.